Welcome to CivilNet. My guest is Anna Ohanyan, a professor of political science and international relations at Stonehill College in Massachusetts, but also she is a non-resident senior scholar in the Russia-Eurasia program for Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Together we will talk about Baku's Military Trophy Park, the current political situation in Armenia, and the geopolitical situation in the region. Thank you for joining us, Anna.
A pleasure, Ani. It's always a pleasure to speak with CivilNet.
Let's start with the Baku Military Trophy Park. On April 12, 2021, Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev attended the opening of, as I said, Military Trophy Park Museum in Baku, dedicated to their military victory over Artsakh. In this park, hundreds of helmets of fallen Armenian soldiers and mannequin depicting Armenians are displayed. Is there any political rationale behind such a move, and what message was sent to Armenians and to others through this park?
That's a very good question, Ani, and I think it's important to look at it from tactical and strategic standpoint. At the tactical level, and somewhat more evident, is that the park signifies the continued militarization in Azerbaijani society, deepening authoritarianism, and importantly, it is a celebration of violence and its use as a political strategy. And it's very much in a public space where a mother with children could just walk in on a pleasant, sunny Saturday afternoon. It is a tactic of intimidation directed at Armenians, but more importantly, I would say it is an effort on the part of the Aliyev regime to prolong this rally around the flag effect that he enjoyed from the war victory, which has consolidated his position. So if you have a park that is going to be there for a long time, it's a way to prolong whatever he gained from the war victory. But in terms of strategic implication, they're unviewed in the backdrop of the continued prisoner of war crisis that President Aliyev has contrived. I am reading this as this could be a strategy on his part to move the conflict, any peace process that will evolve with the greater OSCE Minsk group participation, and move to drag the peace process into a counterinsurgency stage. Militarized conflict outcomes, sort of victor's peace, tend to defy more liberal, rules-based, predictable negotiation formats. You saw Sri Lanka conflict go through this stage. You saw Chechnya, Turkey's approach to Kurdish conflict, essentially trying to, it might be an effort on Aliyev's part to move this conflict into counterinsurgency and apply the label of terrorism. So this is something to keep in mind, and also that militarized responses as ending to conflicts is on the rise worldwide. So this is something to watch, and it's relevant for Ukraine as well. But at the same time, very important, it's also, one could argue, this was a strategic mistake on the part of the Aliyev regime, because it chips away at the strategic ambiguity, what I call in peace processes that on which he has capitalized so far. He has been talking about territorial sovereignty, international law, and regional integration, right? When he speaks to international audiences, these are all kind of globally sound, liberal, even in some respects, statements. But in reality, the park is so grotesque that it makes it obvious that this Aliyev is engaged in double speaking differently to international audiences and different to domestic audiences. Because if a negotiating actor is talking about regional integration, opening up of borders, which is in the interest of all involved, then continuing to dehumanize actors this way is not the way to go about. So I do think the park chips away at the strategic ambiguity that he has enjoyed so far.
We will talk about the Ukrainian part you just mentioned, but let's talk about the peace process. So as a consequence of this war, the role of the OSCE Minsk Group, the core mediating format between Armenia and Azerbaijan since 1992, was weakened by Russia, which acted without the OSCE. And do you think it is possible to bring the peace process back to the Minsk Group format, and do you think that Armenia should seek such an agenda?
Great question, Ani. Russia's role is really fascinating. I think Russia, and I have written for Carnegie Endowment on this, Russia's role is important in terms of that Russia demonstrated its ability to stop the bleeding, but Russia does not have any deep historical historically showcase skills and capacities of sustainable peace building. That is not to say that the West stands out with those skills, but overall, effective peace building requires grassroots involvement, targeted economic intervention. So on the one hand, Russia's role is important because with this agreement, Russia provided much needed ended the violence, the war, which is a hugely important outcome, but also created some geopolitical stability and provides new conditions for OSCE to engage. I do think that OSCE Minsk Group Europe does need to engage with Russia on this, what I call quote unquote Russian peace. Russia on its own cannot do it, and it may not want to do it or does not have the skills to do it. But having OSCE Minsk Group where Russia has a seat is really critical because also I think we should note that the surrounded territory surrounding Nagorno-Karabakh, now that Azerbaijan has recovered control over them, this provides more opportunities for OSCE Minsk Group to move ahead. But at the same time, I think OSCE Minsk Group has to revise its peace-building practices. Up until so far, obviously, all parties, Armenian and Azerbaijani parties, have used the conflict and the peace process for domestic legitimacy purposes, regime survival, much more so before the Velvet Revolution. But at the same time, OSCE and Azerbaijan played a role in this, sabotaging OSCE. So OSCE Minsk Group, the office was closed in Azerbaijan, right? Any peace process worth the name needs deep engagement with grassroots actors, which is why actually the connectivity component that is built in the ceasefire, in the agreement, Russia brokered agreement, can be something on which it's possible to capitalize moving forward.
We just talked about Russia's role. What about Turkey's role?
Turkey, fascinating actually and tragic as the Turkey's role, and this really applies to also how we look at Ukraine conflict. Turkey, I would argue, has replicated a strategy that Russia has been playing since under Putin regime, which is you essentially get involved in conflicts, facilitate, promote what I call in my research regional fracture, which then gives you leverage to go back to quote unquote international audiences and say, hello, I can fix this, right? I matter in geopolitical terms. And throughout the war, obviously, Turkey tried to bomb his way into the Minsk process, which was really ironic. Ironically, also that Turkey did not succeed in becoming a part of the OSCE Minsk process. That should really send signals to Turkey. But the fact that this precedent of getting involved in armed conflicts, creating or facilitating them, and then down the road expecting to recoup or gain some support and recognition and legitimacy internationally is a trend to watch. Now, Turkey is under I wouldn't say under fire, but there's much less appetite under the Biden administration to engage Erdogan the same way that Trump engaged. And I would actually argue that Turkey's the involvement in Nagorno-Karabakh as part of a broader string of conflicts in Syria and its involvement in Iraq and the Mediterranean, this was possible partly because of the policies of the Trump administration. But I think Turkey's position of getting involved in conflicts, trying to get global leverage, this is something from Russia's playbook. It's something that Armenia needs to watch for when thinking about both of these parties now active in the region.
So you just talked about the region, and let's focus more on Ukraine. Recently, the geopolitical situation over Ukraine has been escalating as Russia and Ukraine are deploying troops along the borders in the eastern Ukraine. Turkey's leader Erdogan welcomed Ukraine's President Zelensky in Ankara and voiced his support for Ukraine's territorial integrity. Moscow immediately stopped air flights, and on the other hand, the Europeans, the West toughened its sanctions on Russia. What kind of implication will this have on the region?
It was fascinating to watch some of the analysis that was coming out on Nagorno-Karabakh during the Nagorno-Karabakh war in respect to Ukraine and its conflict in the Donbas region. And much of the analysis was focused on that how Ukraine should follow Azerbaijan's lead and cooperate with Turkey and replicate that in trying to bring back the Donbas region militarily. So this would be the wrong lesson for Ukraine to learn from Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. Militarization, as demonstrated by the Trophy Park, the militarized outcomes, assuming Ukraine even wins this, which is impossible in terms of the West is not going to rush despite the rhetoric on Ukraine's side. This will only contribute to difficulties of domestic reform and state building inside Ukraine. No state is able in contemporary politics to engage in effective state building while being cut off in an ongoing security situation. So I would argue that I think the Russia-centric view on the Ukraine conflict, as well as all of these post-Soviet conflicts, can be dangerous because it removes the need to really dig in and see there are actual reasons driving this conflict. Yes, Russia is capitalizing on it, but there are issues of Russian minorities, the way of their integration in Ukraine. Even if the rebels in the Donbas region, if we call them that way, are supported by Russia, there is a strong argument to be made for engagement. So the peace processes that are on the table, essentially much of the analysis, the discourse is focused on this. Does Russia want that this an agreement that which Zelensky is not agreeing, fearing that it is going to be basically integrating these regions under the Russia's influence, whether through local elections? It's irrelevant, I would argue. Looking at Colombia conflict that raged for 50 years, this is a relatively successful case of a peaceful resolution, a peace agreement, because the government engaged with the rebels and integrated them into the peace process. So I would argue that the current situation in Ukraine as to whether it's done, and the variety of ways of looking at this as to what are the incentives, is it Russia doing it, or relative to US, or is it testing Biden? There are a variety of arguments that are out there. But what I think is this Russia-centric approach is dangerous is that it makes it difficult to look at the conflict in its complexity, understanding the key drivers in particular.
Let's come back to Armenia. You wrote an article with your colleague in Al Jazeera comparing the Armenian and Georgian protests that took place recently. The protests that happened in Armenia after the war were mostly organized by the Homeland Salvation movement that included 17 opposition parties calling for the resignation of Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan. What do these protests tell us about the state of democracy in this region?
I thought that generally Armenia and Georgia cases of democratic transitions are analyzed differently, separately. Georgia's democratic transition is viewed within the Western umbrella, and Georgia's transition was heavily geopoliticized, and the Western Europe and the US do have significant influence over the policy elites within Georgia, which is nothing wrong with that. However, the academics, while in contrast, Armenia, democratic processes here, democratic transition was non-geopolitical, and it unfolded within Russia's authoritarian security orbit. But much of the research demonstrates that individual democratic transitions will succeed to consolidate if they happen in a broader regional neighborhood where there are other neighbors that are also democratic, meaning that when democratic clusters break out, in this case this dyad, the policy elites on both sides need to work to coordinate, to support, regionally support their engagement. This geopolitical blinders of looking at Georgia and Armenia in different frameworks is really counterproductive because it leaves a lot of low-hanging fruit for democratic consolidation in the region. But in regards to the article, what we try to do in the article to demonstrate that it was just striking that you had this tense and this protest happening at the same time. Obviously, the background was different. Armenia's was a backlash against the discontent, deep discontent against the Pashinyan government in the post-war setting. But at the same time, the war, I would argue, exposed the existing weaknesses of Armenia's democratic state, democratic institutions. The same is true for Georgia. While they have different origins, the protests right now, they do face the same challenge of political state building. Georgia's state building has been a lot more technocratic, but Armenian case is a lot more messy, a lot more give and take, grinding negotiations that resulted in the snap elections. That I think is a very important, very positive sign, no matter how difficult that process has been. I think that's something to be proud of for Armenia, that Armenia succeeded in getting to this point, while Georgia does, unfortunately, remains deadlocked and Europeans are unable to mediate. In both cases, the weakness of the state institutions is a stressor for a democratic dividends to deliver.
Thank you, Anna, for this talk.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Ani. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too. Thank you for watching and continue to follow CivilNet.